Mike, what do you think about, as Emery points out, I think we're in a situation where it's very hard to go to the source of these fake news stories and do anything about them legally. We have defamation laws, certainly, that are designed to be a check on the credibility and veracity and legitimacy of the news that's reported in our country. But how those laws function is you have to be the subject of the story and decide they've said something about me that is false and I'm going to sue. And oh, by the way, if I'm a public figure, and this is what Donald Trump is referring to when he talks about opening up the libel laws. If I'm a public figure, I have a harder time meeting the standard of proof in that kind of lawsuit. I have to show that the news site in question, the quote unquote news site in question, acted with actual malice in order to prevail against them. So in a lot of these fake news situations, the defamation laws just aren't that helpful because sometimes the fake news isn't about a person. We have a good example in our rundown today, and everyone can look at everything that we're discussing today on the show if they go to tagpacker.com/user/thisweekinlaw. We're in episode 367 today. There's a good example about Mike Huckabee, who got suckered by a fake news story, it appears, and had to come out and apologize for resharing a fake news story that accused Jewish liberals of being responsible for a swastika incident. In other words, what Huckabee thought he was sharing was a story that said, oh, this wasn't really a hate crime. This was something that was engineered and, maybe even these people were paid. But for whatever reason, this was a fake outrage and not a real outrage was the point that he was trying to make by sharing the story. However, that wasn't actually the case. If he had fact-checked it and gone back to the source, he might have learned that, we have no evidence whatsoever that those are the people who perpetrated this incident. So he had to come out and apologize. But here, there's no defamation remedy. The party defamed there is maybe Jewish liberals. And I don't think they have standing to sue. Right, Mike?
I would think that's exactly right. This is a very thorny issue, as Emery alluded to at the outset of the show. So just to provide a little bit more context for this, according to the Pew Research Group that recently did a study, approximately 50% of the adult population that uses Facebook gets their news from Facebook. And so this is a tremendous problem with people being misled. In the show's lineup today, Denise, as you pointed out, there's lots of stories that went viral during the political season, hundreds of thousands of likes on fake news stories and other things, including such news as, the Pope endorses Donald Trump and other stories that, don't necessarily have a defamatory component to it in the traditional sense of you're defaming somebody, but you're certainly misleading a tremendous amount of the voting population, if not the public writ large. So it is a tremendous problem. I think this is, the problem is compounded that much further by how do you go after the wrongdoers? I think it's very difficult to say, well, we're going to go after Facebook. I mean, under Section 230, they'd probably be immune from liability anyway. And that's probably the right result. I mean, we want these very robust online forums, and we want to make sure that they are protected and that they thrive. I think ultimately this is going to be an issue where Facebook's going to get involved and really, take the bull by the horns here and disincentivize people for doing and propagating this sort of fake news. There was a story that was in the lineup today about, I think, a series of individuals or a bunch of folks in Greece that were responsible for spreading a lot of fake news and ultimately profiting from it. So I think they're going to have to remove that incentive, that monetary incentive for people to profit from fake news. How do you do that? I mean, I think it's probably difficult. Maybe what you do is you quarantine funds for a certain amount of time. Maybe you make your terms of service more robust, and you submit somebody, require that they've automatically submitted themselves to the a certain tribunal, and that their PayPal funds are going to be up for grabs if ultimately they're adjudicated to have spread fake news. I mean, it's got to be something like that, I would think, in order to really nip this in the bud, because it's a tremendous problem, this cyber problem, as the president elect say.
Yep.
Cyber is a problem.
The cyber is a problem. Google at least has another layer that comes into play here, in that in order to be featured in their news search results, there is some vetting that goes into that. Now, I'm not saying that you couldn't find fake news in Google's news search results. I'm sure that happens from time to time, but they're at least trying. They do some vetting there, and I know there are two sides to that. On the one hand, it's great to keep fake news away from people who are searching the news on Google. On the other hand, as someone who started internet life as a blogger, there is certainly frustration and exclusion that happens for people who are out there doing worthwhile information sharing and analysis, but somehow haven't made the cut to arrive in the hallowed halls of Google News. So there's definitely a tension there, and I'm not sure, really how I fall down on, which side of the issue should Google, again, maybe it goes back to Emery's point that you need staffs of people with good analysis skills to figure out these problems. And I just, maybe that's too much to expect.
But then at that point, as I think you had mentioned, Denise, if you've got all these, an army of staff that's going to go through and start reviewing these stories, to what extent do you then lose your Section 230 immunity? If you are actually, the publisher, would you be considered the publisher in that context? So that's a very difficult situation to kind of work through. From a legal perspective, you want to do the right thing, and no doubt Mark Zuckerberg and all the folks at Facebook want to eradicate fake news from Facebook, I would think. But how you go about doing it now? I understand there is a countervailing argument that, well, yes, fake news really drives a lot of visitors and ad revenue as a result, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, I got to think that an organization like Facebook realizes that fake news, even if it might provide a monetary benefit in the short term, is a long-term problem that needs to be dealt with. Because over the long haul, if your network is just littered with fake news and stuff that people can't rely on, it may lose its luster as a medium for people to visit.
I don't know, though. I mean, I don't know. I'm not entirely convinced on that. If we've seen anything from the bubbling of social groups, the social media seems to have, rather than bringing us all together, made us really good at siloing ourselves into little echo chambers. And that feels good on the internet, interacting with people that think exactly like you. By and large, I think a lot of people like that about Facebook and about Twitter. And, I think that a lot of the pushback against Twitter is when, I don't want to minimize real abuse and real, attacks on Twitter, but also I think that a lot of the problems that people have with Twitter are when they have these different bubbles clashing up against each other, and you have trolls on one side being really cruel to people on the other side, on both, going both directions. There's a couple of articles that we have in the show notes today. One from Snopes, Eric Goldman's takedown of I don't think we're going to get to it today, but But essentially, the argument that there is economic incentives not to necessarily stop the spread of fake news is, I think, a real thing to consider. Snopes, of course, has an article that says that, listen, fake news is not the problem, guys, which I found really hilarious considering like 2 paragraphs up. It's like Snopes has grown 85% in the past year thanks to the spread of fake news on the internet. So I guess it's not surprising that certainly Snopes might not have a problem with the spread of fake news, but I'm not also convinced that Facebook, is clear that they don't want to lose their 230 protections. I think they like the fact that they are a social media network. And, I think they've clearly tried to distance themselves from saying that they're a news network because of that. And so are there real incentives to try to fix this problem? I'm not entirely convinced.
Yeah. So if there aren't, what I keep sort of tossing around in my head is, since defamation isn't really a check on these kinds of things, you're not going to try and go after the Macedonian teenagers who are not just clickbaiting, but really socially engineering people into, they're writing things that it's like a honeypot. They're trying to get people to click on these sites because they're things they think their audience wants to believe. Right. So you can't, it's not, as a practical matter, you might have the lack of standing problem that I mentioned in the case of the Mike Huckabee issue, but you also just don't have suable defendants as a practical matter. You can't bring those people into court in the U.S., or you can try, but goodness knows it's going to take a lot of resources and time and determination, and God love you if you do it, but it's going to be really hard.
One of the other problems there, Denise, is these teenagers that are profiting in Macedonia. Money goes. The U.S. dollar goes much further in Macedonia than it does in the U.S. So, these kids may not be making a tremendous amount of money by U.S. standards. In Macedonia, I think it can be a pretty tidy sum. So, again, you've got that economic incentive that's lower in that part of the globe than it might otherwise be in other parts. So removing that economic incentive, be it people in the U.S. or Macedonia or wherever, I think is got to be key.